Today's lecture will focus on Chapter 10 of your textbook, Structuring Ideas, which was, for me, the most important part of the book. And this was the first thing that I sent to Norton when I was trying to arrange publication for this book, was Chapter 10. It was then Chapter 3 because I had reversed the order, but it ended up just about how it was when I started. And this distills everything I know and everything I think about what a paper should look like, the major parts of the paper, the thesis, the introduction, the transitions, the conclusion. And I strongly urge you to read the examples in the chapter. I'm going to talk about a lot of these ideas, but I'm not going to give you a lot of concrete examples because the examples are already in the book. So I'm going to ask you, in conjunction with this lecture, to go to the textbook, watch the lecture first, and then look at the examples in the textbook of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. I believe that this is an excellent way to write papers, but as a sort of objective fact, it's an excellent way to write papers for me. And since I'm going to be the one grading your papers, it's in your best interest to know what I think a good paper looks like. Let me also remind you that your revisions of your first paper are due Friday, anytime before midnight on Friday, September 14th. And you should take some of the things I say in this lecture as part of your revisions. Some of it's not going to be applicable because largely this chapter deals with argument papers, which are the kinds of papers you're going to be writing for the rest of the semester after this first autobiographical paper, which doesn't really have a thesis and support structure. But what I say about introductions and conclusions and transitions will be important for this paper, and all of this will be important for all of the other papers that you're going to write for me and for other professors during your time at Newman. Not all papers, but most papers that you write in college will need a thesis statement. And this is a short summary of your argument, a short assertion. The thesis is just another word for argument or assertion. And your paper, if it is an argument paper, if it's trying to convince anybody of anything, you need to be able, as a discipline, to distill your basic argument into one sentence. Now, you're not going to use this in your education papers that you're writing right now because those papers are autobiographical papers. You're not arguing something. So you don't have to have nearly as focused of an argument as the thesis statement gives you. But most of the papers you're going to write this semester are going to be argument papers, and that's not necessarily a current events paper where you're arguing about a political issue, but papers where you're trying to assert something, where you're trying to prove something. And whenever you're trying to do that in the paper, you need a one-sentence assertion that can answer the question, what is this paper about? Okay, 5 guidelines for thesis statements, and these aren't absolute rules. There are no absolute rules for writing thesis statements, but they're guidelines you should keep in your mind. First of all, it should be arguable. And this means it should be a statement or an assertion that a reasonable person could disagree with. There's just no value to proving that the world is round or that the earth revolves around the sun. These are facts. You can make really good arguments for these things, but there's no point to it because they aren't arguable assertions. So you should try hard not to make your thesis statement so absolute that nobody could possibly argue with it, because that's usually a sign that it's not a very good thesis statement. Second, it should present a single argument. A lot of people in high school learn that a thesis statement should have 3 parts. That America should increase its foreign trade because, and then give 3 reasons, and then write 1 paragraph in the paper for each of the 3 assertions, and then write a conclusion. That's a 5-paragraph essay, and it's a formula that a lot of high school teachers use. It's not a very good formula because it ends up making 3 assertions instead of 1, and what you end up with are 3 interchangeable paragraphs that really don't relate very well to each other. So you should have 1 argument in your thesis statement, not 2 or 3. The thesis statement usually has a because clause, and that's a statement that gives the reason for the assertion. So you're usually going to have, and there are examples of this in the book, you're usually going to have an assertion like education is a good idea, or liberal education is a good idea because it prepares people for a variety of different careers. So the thesis statement, like the essay itself, is going to be based on one assertion and one rationale for that assertion. It doesn't have to have the word because, it often does. The thesis should open up discussion and should not close discussion down. There are some thesis statements that I give examples of in the book that shut discussion down because they say all that needs to be said and they don't really open up any room for you to write your paper. And when you write a thesis statement like that, your paper is going to suffer. And finally, it should focus your essay. You shouldn't write a thesis statement that's too big. Education is all about what it really means to be a human being. Because if you write a statement that's that big, you're never going to be able to prove it in 3 or 4 pages, which is the length of most of the papers you're going to be writing in here, 3 to 5 pages. So look at these things, look at the examples in the book, and then when we start writing argument-based essays in the next unit, come back to this and remember what kinds of characteristics a thesis statement should have. Okay, the introduction. And introductions are almost always the most important part of your paper. I often spend as much time on the introduction of a paper, say a 15-page paper, as I spend on the rest of the paper. And there are several reasons for this, but the most important one is that most readers will decide whether or not they agree with you and whether or not they like you after they read the introduction. And most professors are going to have a pretty good idea whether or not you're a good writer and you have a good paper based on the introduction. And the rest of the essay can influence that a little bit, but it is your first impression with the reader. And that means one thing, you should never have any grammatical errors in your introduction, because that's where they're going to be the most obvious and that's where they're going to cause people to think the worst of your writing. You should use the introduction to introduce your essay and concepts or vocabulary. A lot of times essays rely on a turn of a phrase or a distinction in meanings, any specialized vocabulary that you're going to use, and any concepts that are going to be unfamiliar to people, you should introduce in your introduction. Your introduction must be interesting. Nothing is more important than this. If it's boring, people will either stop reading, or if they're professors and they have to read your paper, they'll just be mad the whole time that you're reading it. So make it interesting, spice it up, use quotes, use catchy, punchy sentences that get people's attention. And finally, in an argument paper, your introduction should lead up to your thesis statement. Your thesis statement should follow naturally from that introduction. Transitions. This is one of the most ignored things in papers at a beginning level, and it really is, for me, the difference between mediocre and good college writing. And that is, immature writers or writers who have not practiced very much tend to write interchangeable paragraphs. And by that I mean that I can take a pair of scissors and cut the paper up and rearrange the paragraphs, and all of the paragraphs would make sense almost anywhere in the paper because they're interchangeable. And that's a sign of immaturity in writing. A good writer knows how to anchor each paragraph where it is by transitions that lead lead back and lead into the paragraph before it, and then set up the paragraph that follows. So generally speaking, the beginning sentence of each paragraph should do something to take the reader from the previous paragraph into the next paragraph. It should show logically how the ideas relate together and how this paragraph belongs exactly where it is. Finally, the conclusion. After you have written your paper, you've put in the transitions, you've created your argument, you've put transitions in between all of the paragraphs, the conclusion just wraps up your paper and takes any loose ends and ties them up. So by the end of the paper, you should not open up any new areas of inquiry in your conclusion. You shouldn't say, well, but then there's this thing, and then close, because that will leave people feeling frustrated. The reader, when reading the conclusion, should feel that your paper is over. It should give it a sense of finality. And a good way to do this usually is to just name the connections between the ideas and show how they support the thesis statement. So you've got 3 or 4 concepts or sub-arguments throughout your different paragraphs. Take them all together, name them, and then tie them up. There are other strategies, and in page 591 to 593, we talk about some of those strategies. But any conclusion strategy that you use needs to create that sense of closure so that the reader doesn't feel frustrated or feel that there are still open issues or open questions when they leave your paper. So that's the lecture for today. It's meant to go along with the book. So read the book, revise your paper, and we will talk more on the bulletin boards. It's not necessary to do a bulletin board post for this video lecture. Please continue doing the posts for the lecture on Feynman and Paulo Freire. Thank you very much.